Welcome to County Hall for today's presentation. Today we welcome heritage conservation speakers. The first one will be Trevor Woods, and then Aoife Howard and John Kelly, in not necessarily this particular order. Without further ado, I'm going to just hand over to Trevor to give us a talk about the Fermoy Weir.
Thank you, Michael. So my name's Trevor Wood, and I'm just going to give a short presentation on the potential Fermoy Weir Remediation project that I've been involved with. I'll give a quick introduction about myself and kind of a very quick brief overview of my career progression, and then I'll go into an introduction about Fermoy Weir, its history, very kind of short bit on the history, our actual involvement in the project, and then the proposed remediation to the weir itself. So my background, I kind of started in the industry back in 1984 in the UK, in the West End of London, working on loads of grade 1 and grade 2 and grade 2 star listed buildings. I moved to Ireland in 2002 to be involved in Dundrum Town Centre, and very quickly got kind of sidelined with the mill pond and the mill pond building, which are protected structures. And actually, to be honest, I enjoyed those more than the multi-storey steel frame building that I was doing before I came to Ireland, that brought me over to Ireland on Dundrum. So in 2009, I had a big decision to make. I'd either stay in kind of big international consultancy land, or kind of do something that I've been playing around in the back of my mind for a long while, and that is to go out on my own and just see how it goes. So in 2009, I set up TWCE with the belief that the recession that was coming would be short, based on experience in the UK, and that there would be a kind of market for kind of my skills after the recession ended. Didn't expect it to last 4.5 years, but that's how it goes. And in 2020, I became CARE accredited. And then at the start of last year, we made the decision that we would just focus purely on conservation, civil and structural engineering, and support larger consultants in that work as their conservation engineer, or act in our own behalf, or also kind of work alongside conservation architects. So Fermoy Weir. Fermoy Weir was constructed in the late 1700s, very early 1800s, to provide water to a mill building within Fermoy, as was the kind of fashion in those days. There was lots of weirs being built all over the country, and in the UK as well, to service the water wheels that would kind of empower the mill buildings themselves, and the milling. And it was constructed with 3 main features. The traditional crump weir at the front, which would just kind of take the normal flows of the river, and then there was a diversion that was kind of the mill race weir wall that would kind of, in flood events, still be able to be overtopped, but would then supply the water to the actual mill itself. And then in association with the crump weir, there is a fish pass, or leap, whatever you want to call it, which is kind of indicated in that photograph there. These 2 photographs are part of the Lawrence photograph collection in the National Library. And this first photograph kind of shows the weir, and it's bisected by the bridge in Fermoy. It was actually built after the weir was constructed. So there's a section of the weir that actually kind of is bifurcated by the bridge, and that was slightly reconstructed in the 1860s when the bridge was built. So the main crump weir kind of sits upriver of the bridge, and then the mill pond kind of weir part of it, the mill race wall, kind of comes along this side back up to where the mill race is, and the fish pass is located in the crump weir part. Most of the weir is constructed from just limestone, all available locally, but part of the mill race weir wall has got 2 courses of old red sandstone, and it's believed that old red sandstone came from a monastery that used to be located in Fermoy. There's a lot of kind of local talk that a lot of the stonework for the weir itself did come from that original monastery that dates from the 14 and 1500s. Just turn the laser off. So what was our involvement? So TJ O'Connors and Associates were appointed as the main design consultant for a much bigger project that we won't go into in this talk, because of this talk is about the weir itself. And as part of their works on that, they had to appoint somebody who had conservation experience, either a conservation architect or a conservation engineer, to assess the weir and the condition of it and come up with proposals for its remediation. As it is kind of more a kind of civil type structure, TJ O'Connors felt it was appropriate to appoint a conservation engineer. And as I'd kind of had involvement with them previously with Dundrum Town Centre, they approached me and we were appointed in early 2020. We were initially appointed to complete a stage 1 conservation engineering report that was to supplement the planning application for the overall works. So when we commenced that, we started off with a desktop study of previous reports, of which there's numerous reports. There was quite a number of principal inspection reports for the bridge itself, which did encompass part of the weir. There was also previous archaeological surveys that had been done prior to 2015. And that's kind of a key date, which I'll just mention in a moment. And they all kind of indicated that the weir was kind of okay, but it was kind of degrading slowly but surely. And it needed to kind of, there should be some work done to it, but nothing was ever done. And then we then undertook a site survey. We actually did 2 in 2020. We did one about February time, but the river was in flood condition, so we couldn't actually get down onto the weir itself because it was too dangerous. But we did notice that a breach, and this is where the date of 2015-16 comes into play, because of it was reported and from photographic evidence that 2 breaches had occurred in the weir. One of them was quite a minor one, where just a couple of the top 2 courses of stonework on the mill race weir wall had basically gone and the water was cascading over those. But a more serious breach was occurring down where the mill race weir wall actually kind of intersects with the main bank. And the breach there was such that it actually kind of collapsed the whole weir down to riverbed level. And it was quite obvious that the river was now channeling itself through that, and the weir was actually becoming kind of pretty ineffective. So when we did our visit in the summer of 2020, we were able to actually clamber over the weir because of the river was in kind of summer flow, very, very low, and it was kind of completely safe to kind of wander all over it and dig around and find out what was really going on and what it was like structurally. So we issued a report in November 2020, and from our report, the main findings that we found was there was problems all over the place. The main crump weir itself is limestone blocks that have been laid on their side with a random rubble core. And then in the 1950s or 60s, a concrete kind of shelter coat, or supposedly shelter coat, was placed over the top. But that was degrading, it failed in numerous locations. And actually at the downstream end of the weir, there was kind of some quite significant scour that occurred. And it was quite obvious that the coating of concrete over the top was actually speeding up the flow of water over the weir and was probably exacerbated the amount of scour that occurred there. The fish pass itself was ineffective, heavily damaged. Most of the limestone sets had been pushed out of place, but it was still quite obvious that that's where the fish pass was meant to be. And then, as I mentioned just previously, the mill race weir itself, there was 2 breaches, and this is the most serious of the breaches. You can see that the original level of the weir is up here somewhere, and it's completely kind of been taken out for about a 15-metre stretch. So in our report, we put together some sketch details of proposed remedials. So for the crump weir itself, we're proposing that the top coat of concrete that's kind of still remaining in place is removed, and then that the limestone sets themselves are photographed in sections, numbered up, and there's going to have to be kind of quite significant areas where they're going to have to be lifted, and there's going to have to restabilization of the core itself of the dam, and then the limestone sets replaced. But in those areas, and we are recommending that possibly the whole crump weir is looked at, that a geotextile layer is placed there as well to try and prevent the fines and that being washed out from underneath the limestone sets. Then at the upstream face and the downstream face is to install some quite significant rock armour in accordance with the design principles within the scale protection of bridge abutments, really, and applying the same principles to this weir. And then in the area where the underminings occurred and scars occurred is actually to kind of create some mass concrete plug in there. It's going to kind of be a bit lightweight in relation to some remedials that have been done, because we don't want to kind of overdo it in terms of heavy reinforced concrete structures for something that's been here for 200 years. Just needs a little bit of tender loving care to bring it back up to standard, or to be able to kind of survive another couple of 100 years. Then in relation to the mill race weir wall, there's two areas where we've got issues. So on the main mill race wall that's still in existence, there's a lot of kind of stonework here and there that needs to be repinned. We're looking at grouting into the actual main bed of the wall to try and kind of give it a bit more stability. We're looking at putting some rock armour on the downstream face. We're not intending to do anything to a kind of a concrete apron that was installed, we believe, around the same time that the concrete shelter coat was applied to the main weir. And then we're looking at placing just at the top of the weir to make sure that the crump weir is the main weir that is in operation when the main works are completed. There's a just a concrete cap. Should also highlight that we're proposing that pointing is undertaken, that's a struck point, but that it's done with a prompt cement. In this kind of river estuary environment, the use of NHLs or even hot limes would be quite inappropriate because they'd be too soft, and within a few years they'd be completely eroded away. We've then got the issue with where the breaches occurred, and from a survey undertaken by Mizzen Archaeology Services, there are some of the stones that can be seen in the riverbed downstream of where the collapse occurred, but it's believed that there's not enough remaining to actually reconstruct properly the breached section of the weir. So the proposal at the moment is to use that stonework to assist with remediation of the rest of the weir that is still in place, and then for this to be reconstructed in the same profile as the existing mill race weir, but quite distinct from the rest of the mill race weir. So it's quite obvious that this is an intervention, and that there's the reporting behind why it was undertaken as well. And at the moment, there's two scopes for this. One is to do it in just in reinforced concrete and have it stamped on the front to kind of resemble kind of a stonework type pattern. And another option that's been looked at is to have it with reinforced concrete as the core, but then stonework facing on the outside. I personally believe that it's an intervention. It needs to be shown as distinct, and we should do it all as concrete and not have any stone facing. Unfortunately, kind of people, there's other people that believe that, oh no, it's got to look like the rest of it, it's got to be stone faced, but in true conservation terms, it's an intervention and it should be identifiable as an intervention. Then we come to the fish pass. As part of the main works, there is a new fish pass to be built as part of a relieving channel as part of the flood defence works. So this fish pass effectively becomes ineffective. Well, becomes kind of redundant. It was ineffective anyway because it was found that these type of fish passes don't really work in the way that they were meant to. So the intention is to refurbish the fish pass. And this is similar to something that we did at Dundrum, is to then encapsulate the fish pass with some geotextile layers so as it's protected, and then place fill material over the top of the fish pass and a 150mm fibre mesh concrete slab, just so as that's an intervention, but it can be removed at a later date. And that's the important thing with any intervention works on protected structures, is that they should be honest. They should be identifiable as intervention type works, but also that they can be also removed at a later date if needed. So yeah, that's my short presentation, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. And just kind of as an aside, There's 4 other projects that I've undertaken as conservation works in Ireland, all of kind of completely different interests. And and that's why I love conservation engineering so much. And John's going to speak later about the whole CARE Accreditation process, which if anybody is thinking about kind of pursuing conservation or involved in conservation, highly recommend it, because it's the only way that we're going to get conservation recognised at a higher level within the industry, within Ireland. And so I thank you for that.
Great. Well, thanks very much for coming. And hopefully you've been given a very interesting insight into a conservation project there, and by a conservation accredited engineer. And hopefully some of you are thinking that maybe you should become accredited, or because that's what the area you're working in. And that's what my talk is going to be about. What is it, and should you apply? I'll talk briefly about what CARE is, how you go about applying, the assessment process itself, the immediate application cycles for 2023, and then if there are any questions, I'm sure we'll do our best to answer them. So CARE is basically a register of conservation engineers. It was set up in 2003. It's administered by the Institution of Civil Engineers, but with a bilateral agreement with Engineers Ireland, so that if you're a chartered member of Engineers Ireland, you're entitled to apply. And we currently have 86 accredited engineers in the register. We need it because we want to raise the standard of conservation engineering across the industry. We want to encourage education and training and promote best practice, and hopefully assist our clients in picking conservation accredited engineers for their jobs. So as I mentioned, if you're a chartered engineer of Engineers Ireland or chartered or incorporated with the ICE or I/D, you are eligible to apply. And being a conservation accredited engineer shows that you have the right skills and experience to undertake conservation projects, that you have the up-to-date expertise and knowledge. If you are accredited, your name appears on a public register, which is accessible to all. You're entitled to call yourself a conservation accredited engineer. We do have an AGM every year in London, which you can go to in person or remotely, and conferences are organised usually every once or every 1 or 2 years, focusing on various conservation projects throughout Ireland and the UK. The CARE register maintains links with all the main conservation bodies and the Irish government departments and government agencies. People like TII all recognise the register and refer to it when they're procuring consultants. So what do you need to have in your armory, I suppose, if you're going to become accredited? Essentially, it's based on 5 principles which are derived from ICMOS, which is the sort of the intellectual foundation of building conservation. It's an international NGO and looks at the conservation of buildings and sites all over the world. And it's set out 5 kind of guidelines for the training of conservation professionals. And the 5 attributes that you need to demonstrate are an understanding of cultural significance, which is, why is the building or the structure important? Why is Fermoy Weir important? What's important about it? Why aren't we just replacing it? It is important for various reasons, and you have to understand why. Then you have to understand the sort of the aesthetics of the structure. Again, going back to Fermoy Weir, it's a stone masonry structure. There are engineering reasons why you are replacing some of it in stone, and then there are also aesthetic questions of form and color and texture that are also being considered when you're designing repairs. You need to know how to intervene, what to intervene, what materials to use, and the correct level of intervention. And that's often a debate in conservation, is how much do you do? Where do you stop? And then there are all the social and financial and legislative factors that need to be considered in any project. And then finally, there's the implementation of the works. How do you manage conservation projects, select the right contractors, make sure the work is being done correctly, and so on. So the application process itself is fairly straightforward. You pay £250. You fill out a form, you provide your CV, which also must set out your conservation philosophy, which is your sort of personal take on how these 5 attributes inform what you do on a daily basis. And then you submit 5 case studies, which are basically 5 projects that you've worked on, which demonstrate how you've achieved the various attributes. You don't have to achieve every attribute in every project, but over the 5, you need to show that you've kind of achieved or an understanding of the 5 attributes. And after that, you attend an interview and hopefully become accredited. The case study format it's quite short. It's not a lot of writing. That's the first page. Fill in that box, 500 words, saying what the project is about. And then each attribute, you talk about how the project and how the work you did on the project demonstrates the attribute that you're addressing, and so on. And then you're done. 5 more of those, and you're good to go. The assessment process itself then is the application which you submitted is assessed by 2 care assessors and a 3rd assessor, who is usually an architect or a surveyor. The interview will be undertaken by the 2 assessors, and it's a 2-way, 1-hour-long conversation, just discussing the projects that you've submitted and your general approach to conservation. And at the end of the day, you will get a result. Usually it's a pass. Sometimes it's deferral, saying, look, we think you might need experience in 1 or 2 other areas. But generally speaking, people pass. And then once you've had it, you maintain your accreditation by keeping up to date with your CPD, paying a £65 fee, and every 5 years you have to revalidate, so you can't sit on your laurels too much. And the deadline, well, the first deadline of this year is passed. It's 28th of February, but there will be another deadline in June and one in October. And the exact dates are available from the registers at those email addresses. There's more information about more detail on the application process in the guidance document, which is updated regularly and is available on the Engineers Ireland website at that link. But you Google it, you'll find it. It's quite straightforward. And I suppose if you are thinking that you might not be quite ready, you can submit 5 synopses to the register, and they'll give you guidance as to whether they think you're ready or you need some further experience. And a very good place for engineers to start in Ireland is to join the conservation group, which is a fairly informal group of engineers who are interested in conservation and who are practicing in the area and meet regularly for discussions about projects and various things. This lunchtime event is from that group, so it's a very good place to start. There are no requirements. All you need is an interest, and you're more than welcome to come along and join us. I said I'd mention, but just very briefly, some funding opportunities you probably are aware of, but just in case you aren't, there are 3 main funding strands for conservation works in Ireland at the moment, all funded by the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. They're the Built Heritage Investment Scheme for smaller conservation works, usually to buildings. The Historic Structures Fund, which are bigger projects, again to buildings, and the Community Monuments Fund, which are for typically recorded monuments. From a local authority point of view, it's recorded monuments of the things that you tend to have on your books. You need to have to look after. And then there are also Heritage Council funds, funding programs aimed at the communities and historic towns, and the Irish Wall Towns Network, which is also part of the Heritage Council funding scheme.
So my name is Aoife Howard. I'm an engineer with David Kelly's, and I'm part of the conservation group at Engineers Ireland, but I'm also on the Engineers Ireland Cork Committee. So that's how this event kind of took part today. So we're based in Cork County Council offices, which is great. So I am an SPAB scholar. So SPAB is the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, and that's where I learned about conservation, a lot of it in 2017. And I'm currently undertaking a master's in building conservation at the Wealdon Downham Museum over in the UK in Chichester. I'm also going for CARE eventually. I'll get there at some stage, but yes, I'll talk about this project now. This is Kilnarath. It is a typical church ruins that we look at. I'm going to talk about the Community Monuments Fund. This is one of the grant streams that John mentioned. It is typically we do a lot of church ruins and a lot of projects like that that are in the community. So some of them are in council care, some of them are in local groups and things like that. But this is one in Tipperary, so not quite Cork, but close. So all these jobs start with looking at going back to the beginning and looking at the history. So on this site, we know that there's a church, well, there's a church ruins now, but we know that this site dates back to 1302. The ecclesiastical taxation of Cashel mentioned a church at this site. Civil surveys in 1654 and in 1652, Cornelius Ryan was listed as a parish priest. But in 1840, the Ordnance Survey suggests that the medieval church was not, that a Protestant church now in ruins sits on the site. So this is kind of roughly the history. So it's not a medieval church, it's probably 17th century. And this kind of fits in because this is a curved wall, which is quite unusual. So it kind of made sense to it. It's not your typical straight walls. So there's issues with this church, obviously. The biggest one is the west gable. You can kind of try to get the photographs from each side of it. We knew going into it, so we started the application for this, I think, January last year. Dermot in my office, he went out and had a look at it and took some photographs, and we prepared a grant application for the Community Monuments Fund 2022 for Stream 1. And Stream 1 covers building as works. Stream 2 will cover conservation management plan or report, and Stream 3 then could be signage and things. So this is a Stream 1 application. So we looked at the whole building, but obviously we focused on what we thought was the most important, and in this case it was this gable. We're looking at it from, this is the south side, I think this is the north side. So in the south side it looks pretty straight, but on the north side it's not quite as straight. So we wanted to kind of figure out what was going on there. And then this is the return walls. This is the south side again, and you can see that there isn't much going on the return walls. So the biggest issue obviously is the gable. Then there was issues of cracks in different places. The wall tops were all very exposed. You can see on top of some of these openings that there's very little holding at their place. And then another issue is time frame. So because we're working within the grant system, applications go in January, February every year. Grants are announced in April, late April, and then at that stage a design team is appointed. It could be tendered, could be appointed. Once the design team is organized, you need archaeology involved, you need ecology, and then surveys and things. So kind of go on. So this is where we go at this stage. So this is the survey. So the survey actually showed quite clearly where what our overturning moment is, and it wasn't in a good place. So this really highlighted what was going on in this corner, and you can see the return walls on both sides are quite fragile. So we really prioritized the gable. So the initial plan is forget about everything else, look at this gable. The inside face of the gable is unusual. We think there was a vault along here, so this is possibly the vault line. So this is all rubble underneath, so we're not quite sure what's going on here underneath, and it's all quite sensitive archaeological material, so it's not a case of just digging and seeing what's there. So this is all in our initial ideas. we thought of lots of different plans to stabilize it. This is some of our considerations. This is a different project in Offaly that we did where we put in buttresses in the front. Unfortunately, there's graves very close to the front here, so just digging a hole in the ground isn't always the clearest option, or it's not possible in this case. And like we said, this is the remains of a collapsed vault possibly here. So again, digging on the inside face is not an option. So we did consider buttressing outside and inside to try and tie it together. Our plan is to retain as much of the original material as possible, so we don't want to lose anything. But we want to make whatever's done reversible if it's possible. It's not always, but that's part of our consideration, is to make it. But first, safety is always going to come first, but reversible if possible. And then we have to think about the visibility of the intervention, because that's something that I think is quite important to different groups, such as national monuments. But we can get into that when we have a look at what our solution was for this one. So this is just some of our sketches of what we proposed. The people involved were the Tipperary County Council in this case, and we had the Heritage Officer, Roisin, and then we had Rory. National Monuments was involved. We needed to get ministerial consent. Archaeologists is involved, very much so in this project, Colin Flynn. An ecologist can be involved, not on all. This one didn't have too much growth. This one just had a small bit of ivy, so it wasn't as important as it is in other projects. And we had the survey. So the survey was obviously extremely important in pushing driving our repair methodology. So in this case, we went over and back with National Monuments quite a lot because it was quite an unusual job. It was quite urgent, we felt. We did feel like a few heavy winters or big storms wouldn't leave in a good place, when we just wanted to retain the material if we possibly could. So we went with, it took a while to get all this approved. So while we were appointed in April to do the work, to oversee the works, it took a lot of over and back to try and come up with a solution. It took a long time to get the survey back. So a lot of things were involved. So it was August by the time we were looking at this and talking to National Monuments about it and trying to get a repair strategy. The contractor was appointed and we got it to site. But unfortunately, weather was really on our side this year, which was just quite unfortunate, because I think with these grant schemes, we've been very lucky the last couple of years, with September and October being quite nice. And this year, October was very, very wet, and it really hindered these projects, and it showed how vulnerable we are to time delays and things like that. Whereas we don't have these sites on site in May or June when we potentially have good weather, and we should be really getting them underway. But what we came up with was we wanted to integrate the wall, the gable wall, in with the rest of the masonry. So we proposed to rebuild sections of the wall. So we built in the masonry in these sections, but we stepped it back so it could be read as an intervention. So people looked at it, they could see that this was built at a separate time. It's a slightly different style of masonry, but at least it's a modern intervention, but it's readable as such. We fixed the wall tops, obviously, and then once we had all this done, we had proposed and we had permission to put a steel U-bar inside. So our proposal is these three sketches are all the interior. So we had a U-bar across and back proposed to tie the gable face to the return walls. Now, because of the delays and things this year, we were held up, and what happened was once we built the return walls, we brought the archaeologists back to site and we had a good chat about what was going on. So the walls were built back. It was a lot more stable than when we got involved first, but we went back to having a look at the base. So as part of the ministerial consent, it also allowed for probes at the base of the wall to see, is there a foundation? We reckon these are kind of the foundation stones along here. So at this stage, this was, the cracks were stitched, the wall top secured and repointed, and this is just finished recently in February. So we went back to a discussion. So we're kind of waiting for the weather to improve. It's a bit too cold this week, but what we're going to do is we have permission for the probes. So we're going to do a few probes in this wall at the base, just to see, is it realistic that we can underpin? Because these graves are in At first, I thought they were very close to the wall, but we've had a chat with the archaeologists, and while they're close, a lot of them are facing out from the wall, but also the medieval remains have been removed at some stage. The graves that are here are early 20th century or 19th century, so they're not modern graves, which is good, and they're not very, very historical graves. So we're in a position where underpinning is now back on the cards again. So I guess we're waiting for the weather to improve. But at the moment, the walls are a lot more stable, and the 2023 works have been completed without the steel. So, and discussions are ongoing. But I guess the future is we need to finish stabilizing it, obviously, and we need to decide on the steel frame versus the underpinning. The steel frame was always going to be, was a backup. It was a security issue. It was to make sure that the overturning issues were sorted. But now we know that their 2 return walls have been built in, so they're in a much better, it's a lot more stable than when we got near it. The CMF 2023 Stream 1 application has gone in, and our plan is to finish off the rest of the walls, but also to finish off whatever our final solution is here. So I guess my thoughts are in this, is that all these projects have different solutions. It's not just a church ruins, let's repoint it. And they're not a simple solution. They all have different issues with them. They all have different ways of figuring it out. So there's a bit of thought required for all of them, and it needs a team. So it needs the archaeologist support has helped me greatly toward this on this one with the underpinning. That wouldn't have been an issue. It wouldn't have been possible if I didn't have confirmation from him that we were in a better position to do it. So the survey told us that the overturning was critical. And then on other ones, the ecology can be very important. Some of these jobs or some of these church ruins are completely overgrown. So, and then it's talking to the councils and talking to National Monuments and getting everybody on board and everybody on site to talk about these jobs. So it's a team effort, but it's very interesting. I think that's it. So thank you very much for your time.
I maybe invite you over to these seats. There are mics, so it'd be much easier for everybody to hear. I can invite Trevor and John as well, and invite the questions from both audiences. I may actually start online. There is a question for Trevor now. Why did you specify struck pointing for the weir rather than any other pointing style, flash pointing, for example?
Mainly because of the existing weir doesn't show any indication of pointing at all. And rather than have kind of a flash pointer in it, to try and have a vehicle more commensurate with how the weir used to appear, that's why we kind of put some struck point there, just as it doesn't kind of show a completely flat face, so it still shows it's kind of, it's not kind of a replication of what was there previously. It's certainly a bit closer to the open joint that appears to be what it was previously.
Well, thank you. Anybody from the room? Tim?
Sorry, thanks. Just a quick brief, I suppose, in terms of the inclined nature of that wall. Was there any thought given into making it more vertical or trying to realign it, or was it just leave it as it is, but stabilize it?
Yeah, I think it looked quite solid, the gable itself, but actually there was a few cracks, and as I said, it was quite straight looking at one side and the other side it wasn't, so there was quite a twist in it. So we were quite nervous about doing anything to underpin as in lift or anything like that. I don't think it was too unstable at the moment to consider that. I think I think a few more winters and it wasn't going to be standing much longer.
And from a conservation point of view, is it kind of preferable to leave it as it stands and stabilize it where it is, or then return it to where it was originally, possibly?
I think it depends on the situation. Church ruins is a church ruins. I don't think there was much to gain from straightening it. I think in other places it's a possibility if the wall is very secure and you're sure that it's not going to. I've seen some of the engineers, I think Chris here in the crowd has done a few himself, that they've underpinned and lifted. But I mean, I worked over in New Zealand, the earthquakes, we underpinned and lifted quite a lot, but that was solid. Yeah. I mean, you have to make sure that the wall is extremely solid, that the masonry is solid, that it's not going to be able for that movement.
Thank you.
It must be actually extremely challenging to with some interventions, like, you know, it's like salvaging a car, how much you're going to replace before you can say that this is still the same car, or is it, you know, the heritage, and obviously in some other countries, probably the sacred places are still being run or owned by the church, so it's in well occupancy or maybe in well conditions throughout the centuries. Whether obviously Ireland has very complicated history, and some of those buildings are probably neglected for so long that it's very difficult to actually put them back into the condition which is safe. And
I think if there's a use for them, that's the thing. A ruin is a ruin at the end of the day. If you want to get a building back into use, that's a different situation. It needs to be assessed as such, and to be a budget for that as well.
anybody else?
In terms of stabilizing walls, you have to be quite courageous. And the first one I did was on my own building, and I've done a few agricultural buildings, but I think one has to be quite bold to take on a building of such importance.
And it was on a slope as well, so there was no steady ground and trees. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other thoughts, but I think it's a very good explanation of conservation engineering principles and the different options. So I enjoyed listening to it all. Thank you.
I want here for Aoife again. The most popular, a quick question. I was curious to know how the dowel bar tying the gable wall to the returning walls was installed, minimizing any damage on the existing structure during the process.
That's what it wasn't installed in the end, so it was still a possibility, but we have done it on different jobs. So you would drill through, you would have to make the holes obviously for the bar to go through, and then put a pattress plate probably on the outside face. But it would be minimal intervention. It would just be a couple of holes rather than, and then they would be tied to the outside with pattress plates, and that way it would work quite well and with very little interference with the wall itself.
Thank you, and sorry for giving me my lack of knowledge in the area. I presume it's not a strict science. There's no such thing like the minimum or maximum amount of intervention before the building could be said that it's absolutely non-historical anymore. I suppose that depends on the structure itself every time, every single case, I suppose. Is
One of the main things you look at is
be one at a time, maybe.
okay. Yeah, one of the things you have to look at is trying to do as minimal intervention as possible. So in terms of the existing fabric, it's trying to remove as little as possible. So in terms of the structure, it's quite often like contractors and sometimes even architects want to remove kind of whole elements of a percentage structure, whereas in reality, it might be only joist ends that are actually wrong, and you kind of have to kind of then do splicing for those. And contractors don't like doing that because it takes more time, and architects sometimes don't like it because of the appearance of it if they want to expose kind of elements of the roof structure. So there are other kind of ways to scarf in the joint as well, but they're all kind of skills that are very, very in short supply, and it's very important when the tender documents are being produced that some of these details are really, really kind of fleshed out and properly detailed up, so as that the contractors who are tendering are aware of what they're letting themselves in for, and that it's not just a simple note of the drawing saying joists to be cut back and spliced, that the actual details are supplied to the contractor and not left to kind of later on in the contract, and the contractor kind of claim, well, that's not what we're expecting and we can't do that and we didn't price for that, but because they don't tend to read notes, that's the problem. So that's really getting good tender documents together and trying to do as little intervention as possible, but just enough. And just as an aside, kind of my take on conservation engineering is it's a bit, if anybody skis, I kind of take it as being kind of very similar to skiing in terms of your experience. And that when you kind of start skiing, you start with beginner slopes. And to me, that's very akin to when somebody goes to university to study engineering, they're very much a beginner. And then they might move on from the kind of beginner slopes to the green or blue slopes. And to me, it's very much kind of an engineer that's maybe graduated, working in a practice, getting their experience. And then they kind of might get themselves chartered. So they kind of then, that to me is kind of progressing to the red or the black slopes and taking kind of a bit more understanding the structure and a few more risk. But then you come to conservation engineering, and to me, that is very much off-piste skiing. And if anybody's kind of been off be skiing, you've got to have the experience to be able to do that. But again, you still might kind of come across the odd area where you get caught out. So it's very much a kind of very much touching, feeling, and getting to kind of know the structure you're dealing with intimately in many respects before you actually have to take it in.
Well, that could bring me to a question to the panel then, which is that in the realm of sustainable development, conservation of buildings has such a key role. It's offering cultural sustainability, and it's involving, retention of existing fabric, avoidance of carbon footprint in terms of new construction. My question really to you, Trevor, is sitting in the middle, is should conservation engineers be key instructors and actually, lead this technology into the engineering profession in general? Because there are certain countries in Europe where it seems that, all engineers have skills in these areas, and we need to be zero carbon by 2030. We need to look at the way we build new buildings, and we need to look at the way in which we preserve existing and work on them as a more general topic, rather than just for protected structures as well. So that's the question for the future. Have to need to answer.
Well, it's
Sorry, John, you go.
obviously the technology and techniques that are used are applicable in newer buildings as well.
Exactly.
Traditional building techniques have a place even in modern construction, definitely.
But I think conservation engineering is a very creative process, and we now need engineers to sort of step up into new ways of constructing as well. And we have a part to play in the bigger arguments in a way in relation to sustainability as well. But it's another argument for conservation, if you like, is that it is sustainable. Is really what I'm trying to say.
I think there's not enough of us, Chris, though, is the problem.
What?
We're in very short supply. is the
I
problem, I
know,
think.
well, I apologize for not quite joining the CARE team yet, but I intend to do it by June. So.
Not at all, but there's very few, and it's not being taught. It's not a part of the university degrees. It's not. We're being taught new builds, so it's something you pick up.
Yeah.
Nobody has a direct qualification as a conservation engineer. Everyone has fallen into it somehow or other, and everyone has a slightly different route, which makes it interesting, and it makes people quite experienced once they're working in it. But there isn't a direct route into it. It'd be great to get some more people involved.
I suppose just a general comment rather than a question. I think you're right, you're in very short supply, and I know as a conservation officer at one point constantly referring people to and it was great to see the stabilization of ruins, but it would be fantastic if engineering Ireland could demonstrate some of the maybe 18th and 19th century buildings, particularly now that the government priority is unlocking housing, it is sustainability, it is derelict and regeneration. Because even big role to play in that, in my experience, I've worked with you on that, so it would be. And it might encourage, I think, more engineers into it. Maybe our engineers thinking it's all just about stabilization of ruins, which isn't everybody's cup of tea, but there is obviously a big opening for conservation engineers in that area. Would be great.
Yeah, we're seeing the Creek Onaha grant is starting to appear on our desk a bit as well. That's kind of one of the new ones, and I think the GLOS scheme was a good one for getting us involved with farm buildings. So there is different ways that aren't necessarily protected structures, but again, I don't think there's enough of us to get involved in as many as we'd like to.
Yeah, it would be great to promote it. I think people rely with certain Creek Onaha in the department. We're having discussion with our colleague in planning and social housing about having special supplies there. So it seems to be ramping up. It would be great to promote it.
Yeah.
So be open.
Thanks, Mona, for that comment. We could definitely facilitate it. As you can see, this is a totally different talk as before. Like, it's not civil engineering as such, or some this is heritage, which is not very often covered probably, and needs some attention. One question I was going to say or ask is, you're saying we're in short supply, I suppose, as engineers, but does it also translate to the craftsmanship? Like, is there a short supply of contractors who are actually even able to do a job like that before?
It is a really scary thing, actually, is that on the contractor side, there seems to be a bit more availability in relation to especially inline construction, and kind of timber specialists. Okay, they have to be kind of hunted down, but in relation to conservation engineers, that's where there is a real kind of lack of people, and because there is such a lack of people, that's why there's kind of not so much of an appreciation of the work that's needed, and it can't emphasize kind of hard enough that if anybody is kind of involved in conservation in whatever form, look at getting CARE accredited. And even if it is just a kind of case of like put 5 projects together and kind of put them to see whether you would be kind of considered for it, do it. Because if we don't get the numbers up in kind of the CARE accredited side of it, there's always going to be a struggle to actually get the correct messages across. On the architectural side, there's plenty of conservation architects out there, but they're not engineers. They don't know how kind of the mechanics of a building work, and kind of how to kind of make sure that the mechanics of the building continue in the future, and that maybe some interventions that might have been done previously haven't actually worked and have actually kind of caused the building to suffer some further damage, and how that can be rectified. But it is something that kind of I'm passionate about, is that we want more CARE accredited engineers. We want more engineers in conservation, and there's the embodied carbon, and there is the environmental side to it that's going to make it even more kind of important that this is an area in the industry that does kind of bloom and increase.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to add about the contractors as well, that yeah, we're very dependent on a very few contractors, and I think a lot of our grant projects, it's very hard to get anything on site before August to be done by October. So our year and their year is in the grant era, in the grant capacity, is very tight and very packed. This year we had 3 or 4 jobs go over time, which we weren't happy with, but again, the weather dependent. The weather was awful in October, but we shouldn't be on site in October. We should be on site in May and June, which isn't happening. But also we're very dependent on the same. Each area we work in, we probably have 3 or 4 builders that we can depend on for a quote, and that's it if we're lucky. And once they're full for the year, and it's very hard to try. If you squeeze in extra jobs, you're losing its time, quality, or cost. So if you're squeezing on time, you're going to make a difference to your final product.
Just one, sorry, Chris, just one quick one on the grant applications. So you've mentioned a few times that they're going in January, February. Would it be a case of, have the paperwork being done over the winter months? Could it be, is it one of the local authorities to try and pull them forward to late autumn, early?
There's nobody in the industry who doesn't agree with this. You can't get it across the line. But we have another problem, is that it's actually quite stressful for us and for our staff, and they've asked us to actually stop doing as many grant projects, simply because they all happen at the same time. You've got to put in all the paperwork at the same time, and all the builders are being used at the same time. It's quite stressful.
Yeah, it's
It's across the industry as well.
What?
The roads suffer the same fate, I'm afraid.
Yes.
It's always happened for roads that every single contractor is tidying at the same point of
I
time.
say we're a bit like an accountant at the tax deadlines.
I know.
Or happy hour.
Anyway.
Yeah, sorry, just one question which probably for Aoife, which I may actually answer. Someone is asking how about becoming the member of Engineers Ireland Conservation Group. Just get Aoife's email there on the screen and get the to contact Aoife. And I believe, as John was saying, if someone is a member of Engineers Ireland, a charter member, that they're entitled to becoming the CARE accredited as well.
And the conservation is a very good place to start, even for that initial conversation.
Tony, is there someone on the chapter engineer interested in the topic, obviously, but don't have a huge amount of relevant experience, other than experience with them over the years,
Which is
probably
probably very valid and probably absolutely perfect experience.
Yeah, and I suppose I would feel inadequate. I'm very interested to join CARE, but I feel almost inadequate to apply. So where does one go for, call it CPD or further education, that would give me the?
So I'd say start with the conservation group. That'll be a good place, and they do lots of online events. So
not always in Dublin. That, I think that'd be the first, yeah, no. So that's the first place, that would be the first place to start. And I think you'd be surprised at, that the principles are the same. Engineering is engineering at the end of the day. So the principles are the same. Once, if you have experience of working on older buildings, there's a very good chance that you will tick those boxes. So I would.
But in terms of, say, are there accredited courses you can do? Is there?
There are courses, short and long. Perhaps we could talk separately after. Yeah.
There's also a few groups. There's the Building Line Forum. They had their live slam, a yearly event last week, which was really good. That's contractors and architects and engineers. So it was a good event. People talk, meet every year. And they usually hold an event or two during the year. And SPAB Ireland, they often hold one of the weekends in the summer. Usually it's Heritage Week, which is in a field somewhere in the middle of the countryside, working on an old farm building, which is showing its points and things like that as well. It's a couple of different groups that are promoting conservation in Australia.
Thank you.
If we are on top of the hour, we may stop the recording now.